Hey guys, welcome you all in T3P Technology is the Point. In this quick video, we are going to discuss very useful in terms of cloud profile. So, as you know, cloud computing has become an essential part of modern technology, right? So, with the companies moving their operations to the cloud, infrastructure to the cloud, so cloud architects are in high demand. So, if you are a cloud architect or you are just a beginner, want to learn for this profile, then you might be wondering what kind of scenarios and questions to expect in a job interview. So here in this video, I am going to discuss 10 scenarios based interview questions for cloud architect profiles for Azure as well as AWS. For professional who is having 3 years of experience, 5 years of experience, 10 years of experience, or you are just a beginner. This video gonna help everyone because I'll cover each question scenario, what kind of questions can be asked from that scenario, what will be the solution, and the required services which is used to provide that solution. So I'll also note down the essential key points from the scenario for each scenario that the company wants to implement. So let's get started. So, guys, let's start with the first scenario. We are having a company wants to migrate their on-prem infrastructure to the cloud in order to improve scalability and reduce cost. So, they may have a complex environment with multiple applications and databases that need to be migrated. So, the question here is, how would you approach the migration of a complex on-prem environment to the cloud? So the thing is, if we were looking for the solution, we need to understand which cloud platform we need to look for our target setup. So if you are looking for AWS, then we need to look for the AWS database migration service. If we are looking for uh, Azure, then we need to look for the Azure Site Recovery Service. So let's understand how we'll approach for the solution. So the first step in the process will be to assess the current infrastructure and identify any potential issue that may occur during the migration. Then we would need to determine the best cloud platform as per our need, as per our applications need, as per our services need. So for example, if our company is just looking for the cost effective solution, then we will recommend AWS. If our company require more flexibility and customization, then Azure may be a better choice in this case. So once we have determined the best platform, then we can begin the migration process by using services for AWS database migration service. And for Azure, we will use Azure Site Recovery Service to move data and application to the cloud. So this is about first scenario. Let's talk about the next scenario, what we are having. So in the next scenario, you can see a company wants to implement a disaster recovery solution for their cloud-based environment to ensure that their critical applications remain available in the event of a failure. So how would you design a disaster recovery solution for a cloud-based environment? So now here we need to understand when we are thinking about the disaster recovery solution, we also need to think about the services what we are going to use from the cloud platform. For AWS, we will look for the elastic load balancing service. If we will go for the Microsoft Azure, we have a service called Azure Traffic Manager service. So in this case, we will use these services for our solution. So our first step will be to design a disaster recovery solution to identify the company's recovery time objective and recovery point objective, that is also known as RTO and RPO. Once we determine this thing, this will help us to determine the appropriate replication strategy and the frequency of backup we need to take care. Next, once we have these things, then we would implement a automated failover solution using the services called AWS Elastic Load Balancing or Azure Traffic Manager. It's all depend on your target cloud platform to ensure that traffic is redirected to a healthy environment in the event of a failure. So finally, we would perform regular testing to ensure that the disaster recovery solution is functioning as expected. So whenever you get such scenario related to disaster recovery solution, go for these services: AWS Elastic Load Balancing Service and Azure Traffic Manager Service. If you're not aware about these services, just go through and understand better. Now we will talk about the third scenario, that is a company wants to implement a data analytics solution to gain insights into their customer behavior and improve their business process. So we need to understand for the data analytics solution what kind of services we are having in AWS as well as Azure. So the question here will be, how would you design a data analytics service for a company's cloud-based environment? So for the data analytics solution, we have service called AWS Redshift, AWS Glue service. We are having AWS Quick Site service from the AWS, Amazon Web Services. If we talk about Microsoft Azure, then we are having services called Azure Snap Analytics. We have Azure Data Factory, or we are having Power BI as well to represent our data. So here our first step will be in designing a data analytics solution is to identify the company specific data requirements and goals, what they want to achieve, what kind of specific data they want to use for their analytics purpose. Then we need we will determine the appropriate data storage and processing solution. If we are for data storage, we can use AWS Redshift or Azure Synapse Analytics. Okay, then we will build a data pipeline using a service called AWS Glue or Azure Data Factory to extract, transform, and load data into the analytics platform. So these are the services which will help us for ETL, that is extract, transform, and load. Finally, we would use visualization tools such as AWS QuickSight or Power BI, whatever you are using, to present the data in a way that is easy to understand and actionable. These kind of data means will be presented in the form of dashboard. So these two services will help us to provide a effective solution to our organization or our client. Now we will talk about the fourth scenario, that is a company wants to implement a serverless architecture for their cloud-based environment to improve scalability and reduce cost. So how would you design a serverless architecture for a cloud-based environment? So whenever we talk about the serverless architecture, you always think about the function, right? So if we talk about AWS, we have AWS Lambda. In Azure, we are having Azure function. Along with these things, we would require API gateway, means we need to understand the API management as well, because it will help us to communicate between our application and that particular function. And in the last step, we will use AWS step function and Azure logic apps. Let's understand why we will need these things. So in the first step, we will to design a serverless architecture, we need to identify the company specific requirement. Then we will identify the appropriate service to use, like our platform is AWS, then we will go for AWS Lambda. Our function, our environment is for Azure, then we will use Azure function. Why we will use these function? To build and deploy serverless application. Once we build and deploy our serverless function, then we will need a service called AWS API Gateway or API Azure API Management to manage API request and ensure secure access to the application. In the last, we will need a service called AWS Step Function or Azure Logic Apps to orchestrate the workflow between the various serverless components. So once we implement these all services, our solution will be effective and we will be able to provide a serverless architecture for a cloud environment for our client or for our organization. Now we will talk about the fifth solution, means the fifth scenario, what we are having. Let's see. In this scenario, a company wants to implement a hybrid cloud environment in order to maintain control over certain application while still taking advantage of scalability and cost saving of the cloud. How would you design a hybrid cloud environment for a company? So do you know, right, why we use hybrid environment? In certain cases, we want to keep few services with our environment, few services to the cloud. In that case, we will use hybrid cloud environment. Normally, what happens? Any organization directly don't go for the cloud solution. If they are enterprise level, definitely they will not go. First, they will move only the services which is not that much critical. Once they take it's kind of a test migration, we can say that non-critical services they will migrate if they are finding it is useful, saving their cost and less management. Then they will move to the critical one. So in this case, we are having few services from AWS, like AWS Outpost service, we are having AWS Direct Connect service, and we are having AWS Control Tower service from AWS that will help us to set up a hybrid cloud environment. We will talk about in Azure terms. We are having Azure Stack service, Azure Express Route service, and Azure Arc service. Let's understand how these services will help us to provide an effective solution. So the first step in designing a hybrid cloud environment is to identify the specific application and data that need to be kept on premises, and we need to determine those application and data that can be moved to the cloud, as I mentioned. So then we will select the appropriate cloud platform. For AWS, we will use AWS Outpost service, which will help us to run cloud services on premises. Because whenever we are using hybrid environment, we need to have a sync between the hybrid on-prem and the cloud environment, right? So in that case, we will use AWS Outpost service, and in Azure, we will use Azure Stack service to run cloud services in on-premises. Next, we will use, or we can say we will create a secure and high performance network connection between the on-premises and cloud environment. See, when we are setting up a hybrid cloud environment, we can't go over the VPN service. Okay, this is just good for whenever we need connectivity in between or inconsistent connectivity. But we are looking for a consistent connectivity, then we need to use a solution called AWS Direct Connect or Azure Express Route service. Okay, that will help us to make a connection between on-prem and cloud environment, that will be dedicated connection. And in the last, we will implement a cloud management solution such as AWS Control Tower or AWS Azure Arc to manage and monitor the hybrid cloud environment. So once we will implement these all things, we will be able to provide a effective solution to our company. Now let's understand the sixth scenario what we are having. A company wants to implement a container-based architecture in order to improve application deployment and scalability. How would you design a container-based architecture for a company's cloud-based solution? Okay, so the thing is, when we are talking about the container-based architecture, it's very useful nowadays because it is in on demand and it's the future actually. Now, not only the future, in present also they are using, and it's very effective. That's why most of the organization are looking for such solution. So, how would you design a container-based architecture for a company's cloud-based environment? In this case, you need to understand the container, you need to understand the container runtime, you need to understand the container orchestration tools like Kubernetes we are having. So Kubernetes is a core component, but we are having the managed services in all the cloud, either it is AWS, Azure, GCP, or OCI. So if we talk about the services which is related to Kubernetes in AWS, we are having AWS ECS service. We are having AWS ECR service. We are having AWS Fargate service. We are having AWS code pipeline service that will help us to build the DevOps pipeline. Similarly, we are having the services called Azure Kubernetes service, that is known as AKS service. We are having Azure Container Registry service and container instances we are having in Azure. So first step will be here to design a container-based architecture. We need to identify the appropriate container orchestration platform. If we are looking for AWS, then we will use AWS ECS service. If we are looking for Azure, we will use Azure Kubernetes service known as AKS service to manage the deployment and scaling our containerized application. Next, we will build a container registry using either AWS ECR service or Azure Container Registry service, which will help us to store and manage container images that we want to run over the cloud. Then we will use services called AWS Fargate or Azure Container Instances to run containers without managing the underlying infrastructure. Finally, we will implement a continuous integration and a delivery pipeline using the services called AWS Code Pipeline or Azure DevOps, which will help us to automate the deployment of our containerized application. So overall, we will use one, two, three, and four services to implement container-based architecture for our company. So the services will be AWS ECS, AWS ECR service, AWS Target service, AWS Code Pipeline service. So ECS service is required to manage and manage the deployment and scaling of containerized application. ECR service is required to store and manage container images. AWS Target service is required to run container without managing the underlying infrastructure. And the last service will require to automate the deployment of containerized application. So just understand these four services. This will help you to implement container based architecture. So these questions will help you in interview. Now we will look for the next scenario, that is a company want to implement a multi-region architecture in order to improve applications availability and reduce latency for their global customers. So how would you design a multiple region architecture for a company's cloud-based environment? When we are talking about the multi-region architecture, we need to think about multiple services again. So we in AWS, we are having AWS Global Accelerator Service, AWS Multi-Region Active Service. We are having AWS Global Infrastructure Services. Okay. If we talk about in Azure, we are having Azure Traffic Manager Service, Azure Site Recovery Service. So our first step will be to design a multi-region architecture to identify the regions where the company's customers are located and where we can keep our data. So according to that, we can choose the regions. Next, we will design a multi-region application architecture using the services called AWS Global Accelerator or Azure Traffic Manager Service, which will help us to route traffic to the closest available region. Then we will use the services called AWS Multi-Region Active or Azure Traffic Manager Service, which will help us to ensure that high availability of our application across multiple regions. In the last, we will implement a disaster recovery solution using the services called AWS Global Infrastructure or Azure Site Recovery to ensure that application can fail over to a secondary region in the event of failure. So did you guys understand? For multi-region architecture, we need to remember few services like in AWS Global Accelerator Service, AWS Multi-Region Active Service, Azure, AWS Global Infrastructure Service. In the in case of Azure, we are having Azure Traffic Manager Service and Azure Site Recovery Service that is helpful for failover. Now we will look for another solution scenario, that is a company want to implement a security solution to protect their cloud environment from cyber threats. How would you design a security solution for a company's cloud-based solution? Do you know security is very important for any organization, and when we are moving to the cloud, it's become more important now because here most of the control is with the cloud service provider. So when we are talking about the security solution, we need to understand few services, then only we will be able to implement the solution. So the services which is required for AWS Security Hub, AWS Web Service, that is Web Application Firewall Service, we will require AWS Identity and Access Management Service. When we are talking about the Azure side, we will require Azure Security Center Service, Azure Web Application Firewall Service, and Azure Active Directory Service. These are the parallel service in AWS and Azure. So our first step in designing will be to design a security solution is to conduct a thorough security assessment to identify if there is any vulnerability in the environment exist or not. Once we are done that one, then we would implement a defense in depth strategy using services called AWS Security Hub or Azure Security Center to provide centralized security management and monitoring. Once we were done with this one, then we will use the services called AWS Web Service or Azure Web Application Firewall Service to protect applications from common web exploits. Once we are done this all, then finally we would implement identity and access management control service like AWS IAM service or Azure Active Directory service to manage users access and the permission what they are having on the resources. So these services will help us to implement a security solution. So I would recommend you to go through these services in depth so you can provide or write down a effective solution for your organization. Now, second last scenario for this video, a company wants to implement a high performance computing solution in their cloud environment to support scientific research and simulations. How would you design a high performance computing solution for a company's cloud based environment? So, when we are talking about the high performance computing solution, we need to think about the EC2 high memory instance in AWS. We also need to think about the AWS batch service that will help us to manage and schedule the execution of batch computing workloads. Then we need to think about AWS parallel cluster service, which will help us to provide high performance storage for input and output data. So these are the services from AWS. Similarly, we are having services from Azure like HPC virtual machine, Azure batch service, Azure cycle cloud service. Now, our first step in designing will be to design a high performance computing solution is to identify the specific requirement of the scientific research and simulation, such as how many numbers of cores and the amount of memory we will be required. Once we identify the cores and memory, means CPU and RAM, then we will select the appropriate compute instance such as AWS EC2 high memory instance or Azure HPC virtual machine to meet these requirements. Once we identify the configuration, then we will use AWS batch service or Azure batch service to manage and schedule the execution of batch computing workload. In the last, we would implement a storage solution using the services called AWS Parallel Cluster or Azure Cycle Cloud to provide high performance storage for input and output data. So these are the three services will help us to implement high performance computing solution for scientific research and simulation or any other requirement where you require high performance computing solution. Now we'll talk about the last scenario, that is number 10, that is a company want to implement a scalable web application with high availability. How would you design a scalable web application for a company's cloud-based environment? Whenever we will talk about the scalable web application with high availability, we need to think about few services like EC2 auto scaling service, AWS Elastic Load Balancing Service, AWS Elastic Cache Service. If we talk about the Azure Virtual Machine Scale Set, Azure Traffic Manager, Azure Cache for Redis Service. So guys, to understand the solution, first step will be to design a scalable web application is to identify the application's performance requirements and expected traffic pattern. We would then select the appropriate compute instance such as AWS EC2 auto scaling or Azure virtual machine skill set to meet this requirement. Once we have identified the configuration, we have set up the virtual machines, then we would use the services called AWS Elastic Load Balancing Service or Azure Traffic Manager service to distribute traffic across multiple compute instances for high availability. Because in our scenario, they are looking for a scalable web application with high availability. So to provide high availability, we will use Azure Traffic Manager or AWS ELB service. In the last, to implement a caching solution using AWS Elastic Cache or Azure Cache for Redis to improve application performance. So this is the way we will be able to implement a scalable solution. Now let's talk about this scenario. In this scenario, a company wants to implement a global content delivery network to improve application performance. How would you design a global content delivery network for a company's cloud-based environment? So when we are talking about the global content delivery network to implement application performance, we need to think about content delivery services, content delivery network services from both the platform. We are having CloudFront in AWS, we are having content delivery network in Azure. To manage the DNS, we are having AWS Route 53, Azure DNS service. We are having Elastic Cache or Azure Cache for Redis service to improve the application performance. So our first step in designing a global content delivery network is to identify the company's application performance requirement and expected traffic pattern. Then we will use the services called AWS CloudFront or Azure Content Delivery Network to distribute content across multiple edge locations for low latency and high throughput delivery. What are the edge location? Edge location is something near to the end user. Then we will also use the services called AWS Route 53 or AWS Azure DNS to route traffic to meet to the nearest edge location based on the user's location. In the last, we will implement a caching solution using the services called AWS Elastic Cache or Azure Cache for Redis to improve application performance. So the services which we need to remember to implement a global content delivery network solution: AWS CloudFront service, AWS Route 53 service, AWS Elastic Cache service. For Azure, Azure Content Delivery Network service, Azure DNS service, Azure Cache for Redis service. I hope you find this video helpful. You can go through the description and go through the link where I have documented these all 10 solutions where you can take your own time to understand, go through the services, go through solution. You will understand better. Go again and again if you did not understand. You can reach me, mention in the comment how you find this video. If you like it, then click on like button, share with your friends so they can also learn. See you in next video with more scenarios and solutions. Keep learning. Enjoy. Bye bye.